afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and welcome to another episode of ISTJ Info Dumping. This doesn't have an official title, but there's a recent phenomena that I have discovered called dominant function projection. I'm not the one that came up with it. I just heard that that was the case from someone in a typology community that I'm a part of on Facebook, and I said, oh yeah, that is actually kind of true if you look at it like that. So what I'm getting at is that every type's dominant function is going to be one that is so strongly used that that particular type is going to be baffled as to why everyone else isn't using that function. So every single Myers-Briggs type is guilty of what I'm about to say, no matter how much of an empathetic feeler you are. Even you know how to get on people's nerves with what I'm about to say. And to a certain extent, if you have any of these functions in the secondary, you might sort of relate to what I'm saying, but it's going to be a secondary concern, hence the name, compared to what you prioritize the most. So since I am a dominant perceiving type, let us start with the perceiving functions, and we'll start with my dominant function, introverted sensing. This is the dominant function for ISTJs and ISFJs, and they will be bewildered that people are so forgetful. ISTJs and ISFJs have a very clear and vivid memory of the past. It's not perfect. No one's memory is absolutely spot on perfect. Even people with photographic memories forget some things. But ISTJs and ISFJs will remember very minute details. They can remember strong, sensual experiences that they had in the past. They might be able to recall a conversation that they had 14 years ago, but they're also very insistent on doing things in a certain routine and with a certain punctuality in the case of the ISTJs. So oftentimes they'll be really bewildered when the other types take it at their own pace, or like, I don't remember what I had for breakfast, or other types of forgetful things. And they'll express it differently because one's an extroverted feeler and one's an extroverted thinker, but generally speaking, there will be some degree of frustration if people are clueless of their surroundings or are unpunctual or just generally can't remember something that should have been really obvious. Next, we have extroverted sensing, which is the dominant function for ESFPs and ESTPs. And this is going to seem similar to what I'm about to say for the ENFPs and the ENTPs, but it is slightly different because they're sensing and intuition differences. For ESFPs and ESTPs, leading with extroverted sensing, they're going to wonder why everyone tries to limit their freedom. To them, nothing matters more than engaging the five senses. And if they're forced to follow along with some kind of social custom or some kind of rule set, they're going to want to rebel against it, and sometimes they might even wonder why it exists. The ESTP will logically critique the meaning behind the rules, take it down to its principles, and the ESFP will just say, you're making me sad. Why do I have to overthink this? Their intuition at the bottom is going to make them reluctant to want to think too deeply into it. They're just going to say, hey, you know what? What does it matter if I overeat? And if people try to stop them and explain the consequences, their introverted intuition is going to say, too much info, too much future thinking. I don't want to think about that, so why can't we all just live in the moment? So generally speaking, EP types are probably the most compulsive of all of the types, but at the same time, they're also some of the most realistic. So I think a secondary thing that they might project onto others is if they're too conceptual. So ESTPs and ESFPs, they don't like thinking about either the future or the past, and they also don't like thinking about what's intangible. So they might get really annoyed at the intuitive types for talking about too much theories and just be like, why can't you guys just speak plain English? I mean, I think that as well, but as a dominant introverted sensor, I think about the past more than I do the present. So they're going to be thinking about the moment, and I'm going to wonder why more people don't think about the past. Now we move on to intuition. So let's segue right over to extroverted intuition, which is the dominant function for ENFPs and ENTPs. It's similar to what I said about the previous types, but for them, they're going to not like how people are stifling their creativity and uniqueness. ENFPs and ENTPs, the thing that they fear the most is a metaphorical cage. They don't like being restricted. They want to be able to be as creative and boundless as possible. So if you try to tell them that their ideas are impossible or undoable or against the rules, they're going to be really annoyed by that. Similarly to what I described about the secondary function difference, the ENTP is going to logically critique why the principles don't make sense as to why you're being limited, or they'll critique the validity of your argument as to why they should have to limit themselves. And the ENFP is just going to say, well, why can't it be possible? Without necessarily critiquing it. And so for them, being dominant intuitives as opposed to sensors, they're going to think more along the realms of ideas and possibilities. Not that the sensors don't like possibilities, but they like tangible ones. ENFPs and ENTPs like to think more futuristic and outside the box. That's why it's extroverted intuition. It's outward. So they often throw the introverted intuitives off guard because they have such a "you didn't see that coming" type of humor. They have to accept that there are certain binaries that even they fall into. And in fact, one of the best ways to trap an ENTP, if he or she disagrees with Myers-Briggs, is to say the fact that you're so adamant about not being categorized is in and of itself a trait of being an ENTP. So, gotcha. Next, let's move into introverted intuition, the mysterious function that always eludes me. This is the dominant function of INFJs and INTJs, and for them, they are the most futuristic and far-reaching of all of the types. And for them, they get annoyed if people aren't ambitious, futuristic, or deep. So they're going to want really intellectually stimulating conversations. Even the INFJs, to a certain degree, like to think about stuff that'll make them really ponder and say, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way. But they also can tend to be a bit annoyed, especially at the sensing types, if they don't have a clearly defined path forward. So, for example, I've had at least 2 friends of mine who are INFJ claim that I have no ambitions, and whenever I do say, like, no, this is what I want for the future, they'll say, well, that's not good enough. You got to make more of a difference. For the INTJs, they might think more along the lines of you're squandering all of your potential. Like, you've got so many skill sets, why not put them to good use? So they have a hard time with grasping the idea that some of the types might be able to live in the moment. Their inferior function extroverted sensing means that it's very hard for them to focus on what's currently going on, and instead they're constantly thinking so hard about the future that I imagine if the future that they're planning does happen, they'll probably just be thinking about the next thing and not enjoy it when it comes. So for the sensing types, they might be annoyed that the sensors either don't want to talk deep or they just haven't thought that far ahead yet because people don't have that kind of ability to see the future like you guys do. People aren't diviners, and the Bible forbids against divination, so how do you guys do it? If you're practicing Christians, you shouldn't be able to see the future like that. And I think another thing that they fail to take into consideration is that INFJs and INTJs are some of the rarest personality types. Supposedly INFJ is the rarest, but I don't know if I agree with that. But what matters is that they're not the most common types. But because they're so rare, they sometimes worry about being misunderstood, and then they try to force everyone else to think like them, and it's like, that's similar logic to telling a foreigner that they have to follow American customs. They're going to be agitated that they have to act like someone in their country when they're used to their own country's customs. But the thing is, when you're around a world full of people that think a certain way, you gotta adapt a certain way in order to, well, I wouldn't say standing out is a problem in my particular case. I'm an introverted feeler. I love standing out. But to a certain degree, you have to understand that you're in the minority of thought. And if you can coexist with your particular way of thinking while allowing other people to have theirs, maybe you wouldn't be so lonely, maybe you wouldn't be so misunderstood. Now let's move into the judging functions. So we'll start with extroverted thinking, because that's the one that I have second on my function stack. This is the dominant function for ENTJs and ESTJs, and they often wish that people were more productive. So for them, Extroverted thinking is all about getting things done as efficiently as possible. They also like to consider outside sources of information as opposed to trying to logically critique it like the introverted thinkers do. So they're going to want to look at statistics and data, and they'll consider, like, what does this professional have to say about it? So for them, not only do they want to be efficient, but they want their sources to be validated by someone else. So a lot of times they might get really annoyed if someone is slow, for example, or if someone is being just way too subjective and using their own personal feelings or their own personal logic to come to a conclusion. They might say, now wait a minute, how can you say you're being objective when there's so much personal bias in there? You gotta think about this objectively. You can't allow your stupid feelings to get in the way. And they also have a hard time dealing with people that just don't know how to live their life according to their standards. They say that they're objective, but man, do they like to tell people what to do using their introverted feeling as a way of bolstering their own personal claims while claiming that they don't like doing that. So a lot of times you'll hear ESTJs and ENTJs saying things like, if you guys would just listen to me and follow what I have to say, then society would be so much better of a place. But the thing is, they're so rude about the way that they boss people around that it intimidates people. And then most other people, their emotions get in the way and they're reluctant. And the ESTJs and ENTJs are like, why are you letting your emotions get in the way? That's so stupid. People can't just turn off their emotions like an on and off switch. You have them or you don't. And I think they need to realize that the method in which they help people needs to be one that is accommodating, not forceful, if you want more people to follow what you have to say. And if you love your objective and outside sources so much, provide the source. And say, like, okay, well, based on this information, that'll help you out. And present it in a nice way, and maybe more people will listen. Now we have introverted thinking. This is the dominant function for ISTPs and INTPs. And they're going to be frustrated that people aren't more logically critical, or in some cases, if they're really immature, they might say, why is everyone so stupid? Because no one knows how to understand logic itself, the principle of logical thought, more than a dominant introverted thinker. And so the FJ and TP types are going to think more about, let us logically deduce the correct solution, as opposed to the extroverted thinkers, which are the TJ and FP types, who are just going to say, well, let's look at the facts. So ISTPs and INTPs will often think that everything has to be logical and you have to completely ignore your personal feelings. But at the same time, they're using introverted thinking, which is defined as subjective logical framework, or internal logical framework. But to me, it comes across as subjective because it's like, if it's your personal reasoning skills, then how is it objective? Because what you consider to be logical, the other person might not. So what if you came to the wrong conclusion? And that's why I trust my extroverted thinking more, because I want to go with what has been proven, what has been demonstrated as being actually definitively true, as opposed to figuring it out by myself, because what if my reasoning stinks? And I think they would critique me for it. I've had INTPs that have made, well, one, but it felt like a lot. And I've had one INTP who was so amazed by my stupidity according to his standards that he made this big involved post on the group page saying, Paul is such a stupid idiot and don't you guys bother contacting him because he just doesn't know how to debate. Eventually he apologized, but the fact remains is that you don't want to tell off an ISTP or an INTP for what they like to do, which is they like logical principles. So if you say, like, oh my gosh, all that philosophy is so boring to an INTP, they're going to think that you just have a problem or something like that, because it should be obvious why philosophy is such a good thing to do. And ISTPs, with their extroverted sensing, might wish that people used a little bit more common sense, being like, for crying out loud, if you do any amount of thought, you'd be able to tell that this is obviously the right solution. I think they could be a little bit more considerate because they have extroverted feeling in the bottom, but most of them kind of repress that side of themselves and instead want to do whatever makes the most sense. So I think if they learn to balance out their function stack a bit more, they could potentially be just as polite as the FJ types. And maybe then they'd be more understanding of the human condition and want to say, like, okay, well, maybe they don't understand logical reasoning, so let's help them out. And then there you go. Now you're a better person because you're digging into your more empathetic and caring side, as much as you don't like to admit that you have that. Now let's move into introverted feeling, which is the dominant function for INFPs and ISFPs. Now, I'm potentially going to say some controversial things here, and while I'm not going to apologize for being able to speak my mind, for those of you that just cannot handle it, here's a time stamp somewhere on the screen. You can click on that if you're just so sensitive that you can't handle my opinions and my thoughts and just want to move on. INFPs and ISFPs, leading with introverted feeling, want to go with their personal moral guidance. So they're going to want to think, what feels right to me? What are my morals? What are my emotions telling me to do? So a lot of times they want to be their most authentic and true to themselves selves. So they're going to want to say, what do I feel like? What is my personal understanding? So rather than using a logical framework like the ISTPs and INTPs do, they'll use an emotional framework. And this is where I have a personal conspiracy theory, and that's that I believe, and here's where the offensive part comes in, so I'll put the time stamp up again just in case you haven't taken my warning. And that's that I believe that every trans person is either an ISFP or an INFP, because only those types would be so gung-ho about their feelings being the absolute truth that even if science and reason, their inferior feeling, is telling them otherwise, they're going to say, well, this is how I feel, so therefore it is, and if you argue against me, then you're a bigot, and because their extroverted feeling is in the fifth and not in the top four, they're not going to worry if they offend people by their decisions. They're going to want to say, let me be myself. Let me express my true, authentic being. They're also going to be annoyed if people try to suppress emotions. I've heard Billie Eilish, is that how you pronounce it? Whatever her name is. There was one time where during an autobiography she made, she said, why don't people just let their feelings come out? Just be yourself. So they might also be very projecting against people not showing their emotions, saying you should embrace your true self. You should search your feelings. And you should come to the realization of being who you are. But then there's also the contradictory, hypocritical nature of, if you don't agree with my personal values, then you're a stupid jerk face. They need to work on their inclusivity a little bit more. Just because someone doesn't agree with your point of view doesn't automatically make them a bad person. Like, I have friends of mine who aren't practicing Catholics, but am I going to go around and say you guys are a bunch of stupid idiots and you're all going to burn in hell just because you don't align with my personal values? No, that's called prejudice. So in the same way, I think that it's possible that people of multiple beliefs can coexist. It's not the ideal, as St. Paul talked about how he didn't think that a bunch of denominations were a good idea. But at the same time, we can learn from each other. I have thought to myself, ever since learning about the Messianic Jew religion, I've thought that it might be a good idea to take more vacations and take more special days where I can treat myself, because they have what's called the Feast of Tabernacles, where they set aside some of the money that they've used, and they use it to go out and treat themselves. So I feel like, in a sense, that might have been where vacations came from, is from that general concept. So while I may not agree with all the rituals that they like to do, I can learn from their personal morals of let's treat ourselves, let's do this, and I can say, you know what, why doesn't the Catholic Church do more of that? I don't think there's any doctrine that says against it. And from what I've heard, there are some Catholics that do celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. They just don't see it as an obligation because Jesus fulfilled the old law. And therefore the old law doesn't need to burden people because Jesus is the fulfillment of it. But regardless, even if you disagree with someone, you could still learn a thing or two from how they act. And maybe you could see it as a dialogue. And maybe if you have a dialogue with someone enough, maybe you'll come to an agreement and you'll say, oh, maybe this person's beliefs are what I want to believe. Now let's move on to the extroverted feelers, which are the ENFJs and the ESFJs. Being dominant extroverted feelers, they want to make sure that as many people are in harmony and happy as possible. So for them, they're going to wonder why everyone doesn't just get along. To a certain extent, the ISFPs and the INFPs are like that as well. Being feeling types, generally, they don't like a lot of conflict and arguing. But the extroverted feelers are going to thrive on some kind of connection. So for them, they're going to wonder, why is there so much arguing? Why is there so much unrest? Why can't we create a way that as many people as possible can be happy? Now, some of you that are INFJs and ISFJs might agree with this to a certain extent, as I know you all like to make people happy as well, but whereas INFJs and ISFJs like to get more personal, where like they might want to do, say, a one-on-one or target a very specific demographic and like preach to those people, the ENFJs and the ESFJs are going to want to make it more of a global phenomenon or a national phenomenon. They're going to want to be the leaders and the organizers of these big world-changing movements, and being extroverts, they're going to be more willing to go out there and kind of shove it in people's faces in typical EJ fashion, where it's, you don't follow my way, you're going to get an earful type of mindset. But at least with them, they're forceful in terms of kindness, but sometimes people don't even like that. So like ENFJs might say, like, I know that something is bothering you. You need to tell me, because you can't just keep leaving it to yourself. And what they fail to realize is that some people like to express their emotions on their own time. And so they need to be willing to, like, find a middle ground of being able to say, like, okay, I understand that you're hurting, but you can tell me about it when you're ready. That way, I'll be happy that you didn't bottle up your emotions, and the other person will be happy that they got it off their chest and didn't lead to heart pains like I had to deal with about 10 years ago. So I appreciate the ENFJs and the ESFJs for really wanting to make a difference in the world. They just gotta be less forceful about it. And then I think that even more people would get along with them. It's kind of the same logic as the ESTJs and ENTJs, whereas for them, they're forceful about everyone being effective and getting it done, but the ENFJs and ESFJs are forceful about everyone being in agreement. So I think they need to accept that maybe their idea is in the right place, but maybe the method in which they're enforcing the idea is not making it possible. So if you want an example of a healthy ENFJ, look at Martin Luther King Jr. He started the Black Civil Rights Movement, and some people said he was so effective at conveying this idea of his that even white people got in on his movement. But he specifically preached non-violence, which was pretty radical at the time, because he didn't want people to go and fight the white oppressors. He wanted the black people to say, we're going to peacefully rebel against all of these negative stereotypes. And that's probably why he's so well known and renowned, is because he did preach in such a way that, yes, it was the typical EJ forcefulness, like, we must eradicate all of the injustice in the world. But yet at the same time, he did it in such a way that it acted more like a more laid back and thought out ENFJ who tapped into their introverted intuition and said, let's think about the method, let's think about the steps of how to get it done. So ENFJs and ESFJs, learn from Martin Luther King Jr., and maybe you'll be able to make just as much of a difference as well. But also keep in mind that everyone processes emotions differently. So you're going to have to learn how to appeal to people's emotions on an individual level, as opposed to trying to create a one-size-fits-all scenario. That was another abstract one. You might be in a room of 4 people, and it's just not possible for those 4 people to have the same emotional reaction to the same situation. And you might just have to accept that as much as you want everyone to be in harmony, maybe they can't. But maybe you can settle for the next best thing, which is, let's go around the circle and have everyone talk about what they need. Or maybe just say, like, hey guys, I know that you disagree here, but maybe we could save it for another day. Like, have more of a passive approach, but don't be too passive. I mean, we need leaders like you, but we also need the more diplomatic types. So the world is a place for everyone, and if all 16 types learn how to effectively utilize their strengths while also learning from the strengths of the other types and learning to recognize their own weaknesses, then hey, I'm starting to talk like an ENFJ. I'm going to want a better place for all of humanity. And so my closing thoughts on all of this dominant function projection is that I think all of us have to realize that at the end of the day, our dominant function is pretty much entirely subjective. Like, for example, the ESTJs and ENTJs, even if their dominant function is objective, efficient logic, a lot of times their introverted feeling, their personal values, as much as they hate it, is affecting their passion for what it is that they're trying to do. So if the ESTJ is a boss of a supermarket, their personal goals are going to be like, I want to be the boss of the supermarket. I want to help people get the products that they need from the supermarket. So they can't be objective. So if there's a balance between the dominant and the inferior function, maybe we would have more results that don't come across as so much of a selfish crybaby type of approach, but more of an, okay, this is a careful and calculated plan. So for the ISTJs and ISFJs, if we develop our extroverted intuition more, maybe we can see alternative ways of being punctual. Or like, okay, well, maybe if this person isn't punctual, then maybe our extroverted intuition can look outside the box and find some other kind of good possibility. Maybe for the INFJs and INTJs, they can think maybe looking too far ahead is what's causing a lot of the problems that we're blaming everyone else for. So maybe if we used our extroverted sensing more, we could say, okay, time to slow down, time to live in the moment. There's a time and a place for future planning, but now's the time to enjoy the moment, then we'll get to the future. So with pretty much all of the types, they like to suppress their inferior function. But if we recognize that our inferior function also has its own strengths and weaknesses, and if we can get it to get along with the dominant, I think we'd see a much better world. But what do I know? I'm just one person, so who knows how many people are going to take my advice. That's why I used to think I was an ESTJ, because I do think that my advice could lead somewhere. It's just that most people don't want to take it, unless if they know me personally. So with that, thank you very much for watching, my friends. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought of the video. Do you agree with your own type's projection? Do you agree that, yeah, I can be a bit forceful with enforcing my dominant function? And do you think you've developed your inferior function enough where you're not so gung-ho about making sure your dominant function does what you want it to, and maybe like working together with what you suppress to be the best version of yourself? Special thanks to my Patreon supporters Matthew Rakowski, Sploon Ghost, and Splatcat. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!